When we speak of love, we often invoke only its luminous side, the joy, the warmth, the sense of belonging. But every light casts a shadow, and nowhere is this more profound than in the realm of intimate connection. Love, when it emerges from the unconscious depths of the psyche, does not come alone. It brings with it the hidden, the repressed, the unacknowledged parts of ourselves, what ancient wisdom might call the shadow. And it is this shadow, not our conscious intention, that often leads love into the arms of betrayal. At the beginning of a relationship, we are captivated by the light. We project our ideals, our fantasies, even our spiritual hunger onto the other person. In them, we do not see reality. We see a mirror reflecting what we long to be true. This early phase of love is often filled with a sense of magic, as though the universe has orchestrated a cosmic dance between two destined souls. But this euphoria is not love in its full complexity. It is a reflection of the conscious self basking in the illusion of wholeness. Beneath this glowing surface, however, the shadow stirs. The very parts of ourselves we have denied: anger, fear, neediness, control, jealousy, insecurity, begin to surface. And the beloved, once idolized, becomes the unfortunate target of these projections. We begin to blame them for awakening what we do not wish to see. The truth is, they did not create our darkness, they merely revealed it. What often feels like betrayal in love is, in fact, the eruption of this suppressed content. A partner who suddenly becomes cold, distant, or unfaithful is not always acting out of calculated malice. More often, they are overwhelmed by their own unconscious drives shaped by childhood wounds, unresolved traumas, and unmet needs. These forces operate in silence until love activates them like a forgotten switch. We do not betray out of love. We betray because love exposes the inner conflict we are too afraid to face consciously. And the betrayed, they too are not innocent vessels. They have often ignored warning signs, dismissed gut feelings, or remained in denial about the dissonance between reality and their idealized image of the relationship. This too is the shadow at work, the refusal to see what is, preferring instead to cling to what was imagined. In this way, betrayal becomes a shared ritual, a dark communion in which both parties are forced to confront the selves they had hidden from one another and from themselves. The shadow within love speaks to a deeper truth, that relationships are not sanctuaries from the psyche, but laboratories for it. They are not havens where only the best of us is seen, but arenas where the totality of the self, light and dark, noble and broken, emerges. To love someone deeply is to invite not only their beauty, but also their shadow, and in doing so, we must confront our own. True intimacy requires more than affection. It demands confrontation with the parts of ourselves we would rather keep buried. The closer we get to another human being, the more pressure is placed on the inner structure of the psyche. Fault lines begin to show. What we do not own in ourselves, we are destined to see in others. The partner becomes a mirror, sometimes clear, sometimes cracked, but always reflecting back what the ego cannot integrate. And this is where betrayal often begins, not with a kiss stolen or a lie told, but with the slow erosion of honesty with oneself. When we cannot admit to our own unmet needs or our own capacity for deceit, we become susceptible to the very behaviors we condemn. We lash out or withdraw or seek in others what we are afraid to ask for directly. The betrayal of another begins fundamentally as a betrayal of the self. Love, in its earliest stages, is rarely about the other person. It is a psychological projection, an unconscious act wherein we see not who stands before us, but who we long for them to be. We cast our inner world outward, painting the beloved with colors drawn from the depths of our hopes, fantasies, and childhood longings. We do not fall in love with a person. We fall in love with the ideal that person seems to embody. This is the illusion at the heart of most romantic beginnings. Projection is not inherently negative. It is a natural process of the psyche, attempting to reunite with what it believes it has lost. In the beloved, we often locate parts of ourselves we feel cut off from. Our sense of adventure, our creativity, our tenderness, our strength. The more deeply these qualities are buried within us, the more powerfully we see them in another. The beloved becomes a container for our unlived life, and we mistake this symbolic resonance for truth. The danger begins when we confuse the image with the individual, when we cling to the illusion and resist the reality. As time progresses, the cracks in the illusion begin to show. What once enchanted now irritates. The freedom we once admired becomes irresponsibility. The confidence becomes arrogance. The sensitivity becomes emotional instability. We begin to say, "You've changed," but in truth, they haven't. What has changed is our ability to sustain the projection. Reality has entered the space where fantasy once lived, and this confrontation often feels like betrayal. We accuse them of becoming someone else, but they were only ever themselves. We are the ones who are seeing more clearly now, or at least more completely. This collapse of illusion is painful, not just because it shatters our image of the other, but because it forces us to confront our own inner poverty. The beloved was carrying parts of us we had disowned. To see them as flawed is to realize that the qualities we admired must be reclaimed within ourselves, not borrowed through romantic attachment. This is where resentment often begins to grow. We feel deceived, but it was our unconscious that deceived us. We believed the myth because we needed to, not because it was real. This pattern becomes even more destructive when both individuals in a relationship are engaged in mutual projection. Each sees the other not as they are, but as they wish them to be. The result is two people in love with fantasies, not with each other. When these illusions collapse, and they inevitably do both feel betrayed, they ask, "Who are you?" not realizing they never truly knew the other to begin with. Love, once wrapped in enchantment, now feels like a lie. But it was not love that lied. It was our inability to distinguish between projection and perception. In many cases, betrayal arises not because the partner intended harm, but because they could not live up to the role we assigned them. We expected a savior, a soulmate, a perfect companion. They, being human, eventually revealed their imperfections, and we took this as a personal injury. In truth, the injury was to our illusion, not to our soul. Yet the pain is real, because the illusion was deeply tied to our identity. We feel abandoned, not only by the partner, but by the version of ourselves we experienced in their presence. That version too must die. The work of true love begins where projection ends, but most never reach that point. They move from one illusion to another, one partner to the next, hoping to find someone who matches the internal ideal perfectly. But such a person does not exist. No one can carry the full weight of another's unlived life. No one can be forever immune to the disillusionment that intimacy demands. Love that endures must be grounded in reality, in seeing and being seen beyond the veil of fantasy. Yet few have the courage to let the illusion die, and so they retreat or betray or are betrayed by someone who could not bear the weight of the role they never asked to play. The tragedy is that many relationships could survive, even flourish, if both partners were willing to admit how much of their love was built on illusion. If they could name the projections and own them, rather than accuse the other of being the source of disappointment, a new kind of intimacy could emerge, one built not on fantasy, but on shared truth. However, the ego resists this reckoning. It prefers the clarity of blame to the ambiguity of self-inquiry. And so, betrayal becomes the final act in the drama of projection. Love, in its purest form, longs for openness. It seeks expression, transparency, and communion. But for many, the act of loving becomes entangled with fear of conflict, fear of abandonment, fear of appearing too much or not enough. And so, instead of expressing what is true, we repress it. We hide our anger behind silence, our disappointment behind politeness, our unmet needs behind a smile. We convince ourselves that this is love, that to preserve harmony we must suppress the storm. But what is silenced does not vanish. It descends deeper into the psyche and ferments into resentment. Repression is not a conscious decision in most relationships. It begins subtly. One partner says something that wounds, and the other lets it pass. A need goes unmet, and instead of naming it, one shrinks to accommodate. Again and again, these moments accumulate. The unspoken builds like sediment beneath still water. Outwardly, the relationship appears calm. Inwardly, pressure mounts. What begins as an act of self-sacrifice eventually distorts into bitterness. The very love that inspired the initial repression begins to rot from within. This dynamic is particularly insidious because it masquerades as virtue. We tell ourselves we are being kind, patient, understanding. But often we are simply afraid to disturb the illusion of peace, afraid to be seen in our rawness, afraid to risk the rejection that might follow truth. The irony is that, in avoiding conflict, we guarantee it. For what is repressed becomes charged. The more we push it down, the more power it gains. And when it finally erupts, it does so with the force of everything left unsaid. Resentment is not born from disagreement, it is born from disconnection. When one is no longer allowed, or no longer allows oneself, to be authentic, the relationship becomes a performance. Words become calculated, affection becomes mechanical, and somewhere beneath the surface, the heart begins to close. Love requires vulnerability. Without it, even the most peaceful relationship becomes sterile, and the partner we once adored begins to feel like a stranger. Often, betrayal emerges in precisely this space of emotional drought. One partner, starved for recognition, connection, or emotional freedom, seeks outside what they could not find within the relationship. To the one who is betrayed, the act feels sudden, senseless, a violation. But in many cases, it is the result of years of silent suffering, both on the part of the betrayer and the betrayed. The one who stepped out may not have been driven by lust or malice, but by desperation, a hunger to feel alive, to be seen, to escape the prison of polite pretense. This does not excuse betrayal, but it does reveal its deeper roots. Relationships that forbid the expression of pain or frustration become breeding grounds for passive aggression, contempt, and ultimately, collapse. When truth is sacrificed in the name of comfort, the relationship is no longer a place of growth. It becomes a cage. The one who represses becomes resentful. The one who is resented becomes confused, wondering where the warmth went, why the love has cooled. And both suffer in silence, mistaking repression for peace. What we must understand is that love cannot thrive without conflict. Not the violent, destructive kind, but the kind that arises from honesty. It is through conflict, through the willingness to reveal one's wounds, desires, and disappointments, that intimacy is deepened. Repression may feel safer in the moment, but it comes at a cost. The unsaid becomes a wall, the unexpressed becomes a wedge. And over time, what once felt like unity begins to feel like exile. In this exile, betrayal often appears as a door. It offers escape, release, the illusion of vitality, but it is only a symptom of the deeper illness, the inability to speak truth within the container of love. Relationships that do not allow for authentic expression are doomed to disintegration, not because the love is weak, but because it is untested. And untested love, no matter how beautiful it appears, remains fragile. Deep within the human psyche exists a cast of ancient characters, archetypes that shape our lives, often without our conscious awareness. These figures are not inventions of fiction, but elemental patterns of human experience. Among them, the archetype of the betrayer holds a particularly haunting power. We are drawn to this figure with fascination and fear, as it represents not only the possibility of being wronged by another, but also the potential within ourselves to deceive, abandon, and destroy what we once held sacred. To understand betrayal in love, we must confront this archetype, not as something foreign, but as something profoundly internal. When we are betrayed, our first instinct is to look outward, to assign blame, to paint the other as the villain who disrupted the sanctity of love. We say they lied, they cheated, they broke the unspoken vow, and often this is true. But what makes betrayal so shattering is not merely the act itself. It is the recognition that someone we trusted with our vulnerability, someone who once held our heart, could become an agent of pain. This confrontation is archetypal in nature. The betrayer, once hidden in the shadows of myth and story, now wears the face of someone we loved. Yet what we often fail to see is that betrayal is not a foreign element invading love. It is part of the architecture of human relationships. The betrayer is a figure that emerges not only in fairy tales or tragedies, but in the intimate lives of everyday people. And more unsettling still, the betrayer is not only the other. We are all capable of playing this role. It exists within us, dormant until awakened by unmet needs, suppressed emotions, or unresolved psychic conflicts. The archetype of the betrayer is not evil by nature. It is disruptive, yes, but also revelatory. It forces into the open what has long been denied. It challenges the false harmony of relationships built on illusion, repression, or dependency. In many cases, betrayal comes not from hatred, but from a desire for freedom, from a life that feels stagnant, from roles that feel suffocating, from emotions that have no outlet. The act of betrayal becomes a tragic attempt at liberation, a misguided but deeply human impulse to break out of psychic imprisonment. To see betrayal only through the lens of morality is to miss its psychological depth. The betrayer is not always a cruel figure. Sometimes they are simply a person who could no longer carry the weight of expectation, of idealization, of a role they did not choose. They may not even fully understand their actions, because they are being moved by forces larger than themselves, unconscious drives, ancestral patterns, unacknowledged desires. The archetype moves through them, and they act it out, unaware that they are part of a much larger story playing itself out through their choices. Those who are betrayed must also reckon with their own encounter with this archetype, not as its expression, but as its victim. In this experience, the innocent part of the self feels annihilated. The one who trusted, who hoped, who gave unconditionally, now feels destroyed. And yet, in this destruction lies the opportunity for transformation. To be betrayed is to be initiated. It breaks the ego's illusion of safety. It strips away naive assumptions. It demands a confrontation with the truth, not only about the other person, but about the self. This is where the deeper dimension of betrayal reveals itself. The outer act mirrors an inner fragmentation. Somewhere along the line, we may have betrayed ourselves, compromised our boundaries, silenced our intuition, abandoned our needs. The external betrayal brings this inner split into awareness. The pain is not only that we were deceived by someone else, but that we deceived ourselves willfully or unconsciously. In this way, betrayal becomes a mirror. It reflects not only the failure of another, but the places within us that are still in shadow. The archetype of the betrayer, then, is not just a destroyer, it is also a catalyst. It pushes us to see what we would rather not see. It reveals the cost of denial. It unmasks the truth of our relationships and often the truth of ourselves. Those who integrate this archetype, who face it, name it, and own their relationship to it, emerge from betrayal not as victims, but as individuals who have encountered a deeper layer of human reality. They understand that love is not free of darkness, and that every bond we form carries within it the seed of rupture. Wounding is not an aberration in the path of love. It is part of its architecture. To be wounded in love is to be opened. The pain that comes with betrayal, abandonment, or heartbreak is not just emotional. It is archetypal, reaching into the depths of the psyche and disrupting the illusions we have constructed around identity, intimacy, and permanence. These wounds are not only the result of someone else's action. They are the collapse of the stories we told ourselves about who we were in relation to another. And in this collapse lies the possibility of transformation, a journey that few choose, but which ultimately leads to a more authentic self. Betrayal is not merely an external event. It is an encounter with chaos. It destabilizes the ego, tears through the narrative coherence of a relationship, and forces the psyche to confront its own limitations. The individual who is betrayed is not only dealing with the loss of trust, they are confronted with the death of who they were before the wound. This death is not metaphorical, it is psychic and existential. It is the end of a version of oneself that believed in certainty, in protection, in emotional invulnerability. And this death must be grieved fully before any true transformation can begin. In mythology and ancient psychology, the wound is often the beginning of initiation. Heroes and heroines are not transformed by comfort, they are transformed by crisis. It is the descent into darkness, the painful stripping away of all that once gave them security, that births a deeper wisdom. In the same way, betrayal forces us into the underworld of the soul. It takes away the person we loved, the dream we clung to, and in doing so, takes away our illusions. What is left is rawness, a kind of psychological nakedness. But this very rawness is what makes the transformation possible. The pain of betrayal strips us of the false self. This false self is constructed over time, built from societal expectations, past traumas, cultural myths about love, and our own deep-seated fears of inadequacy. In love, we often project this false self outward, seeking validation through the eyes of the beloved. When the relationship is ruptured, we are forced to stand alone, to ask the terrifying question, who am I without them? The answer, though difficult to discover, is the beginning of individuation. the process of becoming whole in and of oneself. Many people flee from this process. The pain is too much, and so they numb it, suppress it, or distract themselves through rebound relationships, addictions, or denial. But those who stay with the wound, who refuse to look away, begin to encounter something sacred. The wound becomes a teacher. It reveals not only the limits of the former relationship, but the unresolved parts of the self that sought salvation in another. It shows us where we abandoned our boundaries, where we silenced our voices, where we substituted fantasy for truth. In this way, betrayal becomes a portal to self-recovery. To heal is not simply to feel better, it is to see more clearly. The clarity that comes through wounding is not comforting at first. It is often brutal. We see how we co-created the relationship dynamic, how we ignored signs, how we participated in our own forgetting. But with this clarity comes the power to choose differently. The one who has walked through betrayal with eyes open becomes more discerning, not cynical but wise. They are no longer seduced by superficial charm or blind idealism. They know the cost of self-abandonment, and they vow not to pay that price again. The wound, paradoxically, becomes the site of strength. What was once vulnerability becomes insight. What was once brokenness becomes integrity. The individual who has integrated their wound no longer seeks completion in another. They are capable of loving without illusion, of giving without losing themselves. This is not the naive love of fairy tales, but the conscious love of those who have known darkness and emerged whole. The wound does not close by forgetting or moving on quickly. It closes by deepening, by allowing pain to stretch the soul's capacity for truth, and by accepting that transformation is born not through comfort, but through conscious suffering. And so, we come to understand that love, in its most transformative form, is not a sanctuary free of pain, but a crucible, one that exposes, refines, and ultimately reveals the soul. Betrayal is not the opposite of love. It is what love, untended or misunderstood, can become. It arrives not only as a wound, but as a revelation, tearing away illusion, confronting repression, and forcing into view the archetypes we carry within us, both light and shadow. Love turns to betrayal when we idolize rather than see, when we suppress rather than speak, when we cling to projections rather than confront reality. And in the ashes of that betrayal, something more honest can begin. Not the fairy tale of romantic perfection, but the hard, one wisdom that comes from facing our own darkness and refusing to look away. It is only through that darkness that a deeper form of love can emerge, one rooted not in fantasy, but in truth. One that does not fear the shadow, but integrates it. One that does not escape pain, but finds meaning in it. In the end, betrayal is not the end of love, but the initiation into a love that no longer hides from the self.